Sodom and Gomorrah, two cities famous for their destruction by fire and brimstone. But what exactly triggered God's wrath? Was it just one specific sin? Or were there multiple hidden ones festering within these cities? The story of Sodom and Gomorrah, found in the book of Genesis, is more than just an account of two cities brought to ruin. It's about the hidden moral decay that was happening beneath the surface, decay that led to their ultimate destruction. These cities were thriving, abundant in wealth and opportunity, but despite their outward success, they were crumbling from the inside. And that internal collapse carried with it lessons for all generations, including ours today. It all begins with pride. Pride is often referred to as the root of all sin, and in Sodom and Gomorrah, it was no different. These cities were wealthy, self-sufficient, and basking in their material success. Ezekiel 16:49 tells us that pride was one of their core sins. The people of Sodom and Gomorrah thought they had it all: riches, land, and security. This led them to believe they didn't need God. They were filled with arrogance, thinking their accomplishments were a result of their own efforts and that they were untouchable. But the Bible consistently warns us that pride leads to destruction. The pride of Sodom and Gomorrah blinded them to their moral decay, making them deaf to the warnings that God sent. They saw no need to change because they believed they had everything under control. Another hidden sin that led to the fall of Sodom and Gomorrah was how they ignored the poor. Even though these cities were wealthy and had plenty of food, they refused to help those in need. Ezekiel 16:49 tells us that they had abundant food and careless ease, but still, they didn't care for the poor or the needy. Instead of sharing their wealth and blessing others, they kept everything for themselves, becoming selfish and blind to the suffering around them. This wasn't just a small mistake. It was a big problem that spread throughout their culture. The people became so comfortable with their riches that they stopped caring about others. They didn't think helping the less fortunate was worth their time. They were too focused on themselves. This lack of care for the poor is one of the reasons why their punishment was so severe. God's heart is always with the poor and the weak, and by ignoring them, Sodom and Gomorrah showed just how far they had drifted from what was right. So, here's something to think about. Are we guilty of the same thing today? When we think of Sodom and Gomorrah, sexual sin is usually what comes to mind, and rightly so. The sexual immorality in Sodom was well known, but it was much worse than we might think. In Genesis 19, we read about a terrifying moment when the men of Sodom gathered outside Lot's house, demanding that he send out his guests, who were actually angels, so they could abuse them. This wasn't just about lust. It was about completely ignoring human dignity and using others for their own selfish power. What's even more alarming is that this behavior wasn't rare in Sodom. It was everywhere. But this wasn't just a one-time thing. The whole culture of Sodom had embraced these behaviors, losing any sense of respect for life and the boundaries God had set. They forgot that our bodies are made in God's image and are meant to be treated with honor. It wasn't just a private issue. It affected the whole society. The destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah is a clear warning about what happens when sexual sin is left unchecked. Sexual immorality wasn't the only problem in Sodom. Violence was everywhere too. These cities had become places where lawlessness ruled, and people acted however they wanted. Genesis 19 shows us how aggressive the people had become when the mob surrounded Lot's house, demanding to harm his visitors. This wasn't just an isolated moment. It was a sign of how deeply lawless the whole city had become. In Jude 1:7, Sodom and Gomorrah are described as being full of gross immorality and lawlessness. Their sins weren't hidden away. They were out in the open, celebrated without any shame. There was no justice, no respect for human life. The strong preyed on the weak, and there was no clear sense of right or wrong. Violence always follows when people reject God's way. Sodom and Gomorrah had completely turned away from peace and justice, and they chose cruelty and oppression instead. Their destruction wasn't just a punishment. It was the result of a society that had lost its way and could no longer live in harmony with one another or with God. Does this sound familiar? Are we too becoming desensitized to violence and injustice around us? What can we learn from the downfall of Sodom and Gomorrah to make sure we don't repeat the same mistakes? Another lesser-known sin that contributed to the downfall of Sodom and Gomorrah was their complete disregard for hospitality. In biblical times, hospitality wasn't just a social expectation. It was a sacred duty. When travelers or strangers entered a city, they were to be welcomed and cared for. This act of hospitality reflected a person's heart and their relationship with God. Lot exemplified this when he insisted on welcoming the angelic visitors into his home. But the rest of the city had no such regard for these visitors. Instead of offering protection and hospitality, the people of Sodom sought to exploit and harm them. Their behavior toward Lot's guests was not just a violation of ancient customs, but a clear indication of their moral bankruptcy. Hospitality is about more than offering food and shelter. It's about recognizing the value of others. The men of Sodom had lost all sense of this, and their actions were driven by selfishness, greed, and cruelty. They had forgotten that every person, including strangers, is made in the image of God and deserves to be treated with dignity. One of the saddest parts of the story of Sodom and Gomorrah is that people were given warnings. God, in His mercy, gave them a chance to turn away from their sinful ways, but they didn't take it seriously. When the angels visited Lot and told him to get his family and leave the city, even then, Lot's sons-in-law just laughed. They thought it was all a big joke, never imagining that destruction could actually happen to them. But what does this reveal? It shows a deeper problem: their pride and refusal to listen to God. God's warnings weren't vague, they were clear and direct. But the people of Sodom had become so comfortable in their sinful lifestyle, so sure of their own way of doing things, that they couldn't even consider the idea that there might be consequences. Their hearts were hardened, and their pride blinded them to the reality of God's judgment. Doesn't this still happen today? How many times do we feel God urging us to make changes in our lives, but we brush it off, thinking we have more time? Just like the people of Sodom, we can get caught in the trap of thinking we're safe, that we won't face judgment. But eventually, just like for Sodom and Gomorrah, the consequences catch up. Are we listening to God's warnings? Or are we ignoring His call for repentance? If you're enjoying this exploration of biblical truth, don't forget to like this video and subscribe for more content. Your support helps us bring these important messages to more people. Lot, Abraham's nephew, is often remembered as a righteous man, but his story is also a warning about compromise. Lot chose to live near Sodom because the land looked good and promised success. But over time, he didn't just live near Sodom, he became part of it. He got comfortable in a sinful environment, and that comfort came with a cost. Have you ever thought about how easy it is to get used to something wrong if you're around it long enough? Lot didn't fully embrace the sin of Sodom, but he was close enough to it that it slowly started to affect him. His choice to live there put his entire family in danger. When the angels warned him to flee, he hesitated. Why? Because his ties to the city had grown stronger than he realized. Lot's story reminds us to be careful where we live and what we surround ourselves with. Even if we don't fully participate in sin, living close to it can chip away at our values and lead to compromise. How often do we tell ourselves we can handle temptation, only to find it pulling us deeper than we expected? One of the most memorable parts of the story is what happened to Lot's wife. As they fled the city, the angels gave clear instructions: don't look back. But Lot's wife couldn't resist. She turned around, longing for the life she was leaving behind, and was turned into a pillar of salt. What made her look back? Was it the comforts of the life she knew in Sodom? The wealth or pleasures of the city? Whatever it was, she couldn't fully let go, and it cost her everything. Is there something in your life that you find hard to let go of, even when you know God is calling you to leave it behind? Lot's wife's story is a powerful reminder that when God calls us to move on from something, we must do so completely. Looking back and holding on to sin will only bring destruction. What are you still holding on to that might be keeping you from moving forward? After Sodom and Gomorrah were destroyed, Lot and his daughters found themselves hiding in a cave, isolated and desperate. Lot's daughters made a heartbreaking decision. Fearing they would have no future without children, they engaged in incest with their father to keep their family line going. The children born from this act became the ancestors of the Moabites and the Ammonites, nations that later opposed Israel. This part of the story shows us that the consequences of sin don't just end with us. Our actions can ripple out, affecting others and even future generations. Lot's daughters had been deeply affected by the corrupt culture they grew up in, and their choices reflected that. Have you ever thought about how your choices might impact not only your life, but the lives of others around you? The decisions we make today can have lasting consequences, not just for us, but for those who come after us. It's a sobering reminder to be mindful of the choices we make, especially in times of fear or desperation. The story of Sodom and Gomorrah isn't just about the destruction of two cities. It's about the choices we all face. Pride, neglect of others, sexual sin, violence, and ignoring God's warnings all contributed to the fall of these cities. But even then, God gave them a chance. He warned them through Lot, just like He warns us today. Are we learning from their mistakes? The sins that destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah, pride, sexual immorality, and a lack of care for the poor are still present in our world today. But the good news is, just like Lot and his family were given a way out, God's mercy is still available to us today. Are we listening to His voice? Are we willing to leave behind what's holding us back and follow His call? God's warnings are not meant to scare us, but to save us. Let's choose faithfulness and obedience today, knowing that His mercy is always within reach for those who listen and obey. If you've been encouraged by this message and want to dive deeper into your faith, click on the next video to continue exploring the Bible with us.